Does the most wonderful time of year feel more like the most overwhelming time of year?
If you struggle with holiday stress, last-minute shopping, and saying yes to everything, you're not alone.
Take Control ADHD is excited to announce a brand new workshop series, Conquer the Holidays with ADHD.
4 practical sessions starting October 25th will cover strategic planning, managing overwhelm, decluttering for guests, and post-holiday reset.
Each session includes a 60-minute workshop plus a full hour of body doubling, so you actually get things done, not just talked about.
You'll get your holiday preparation guide, recordings of all the sessions, and support from a community that truly gets it.
The complete series is on sale right now for just $165. That's $75 off the regular price. Or you can grab single sessions for $50 each, $25 off the regular price right now.
This year, experience less stress and more joy. Register now at takecontroladhd.com/holidays. That's takecontroladhd.com/holidays and make 2025 your best holiday season yet.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to Taking Control, the ADHD podcast on True Story FM. I'm Pete Wright, and I'm here with Nikki Kinzer. Hello, Nikki.
Hello, everyone. Hello, Pete.
Kind of
Wright.
leaning into a wrestling kind of a thing. Nikki Kinzer.
Pete Wright.
We're doing something. We have never talked about what it actually takes as an adult to get diagnosed for realsies. And so we're going to do that today. I can't believe it's taken us quite so long.
We have talked about it.
Not like today we haven't.
Not like today, but we have talked about it.
I think we've talked adjacent to it.
Yeah, maybe adjacent to it. Because I remember.
I know I've never talked about my specific diagnosis experience.
No.
Not after that psychologist told me I have ADHD and that I should talk to him about it.
Right. That's true.
Yeah.
No, but I do remember us talking about like the comorbid conditions and
we
how
did talk
like
about
doctors
comorbid.
have to like kind of, really figure out what are the layers. Is it depression, anxiety, ADHD, like those kinds of things? That's what I'm thinking about.
Yes.
But not the actual testing and what it looks like and all of that. Our guest is going to inform us on what that is.
Totally. And I think it's really important because I think the word diagnosis has gotten all tossed and twisted and tossed up. And now it can mean anything from a 15-minute TikTok video to, 15 minutes with your primary care physician. And suddenly you have ADHD, which may be all you needed to know, which is fine. But if you really want a diagnosis, what does it really, really, really take? And so that's what we're going to talk about today. But first, you know the drill. If this show has ever helped you understand your relationship with ADHD in a new way, we're asking for your support on Patreon. Starting at just $5 a month, you help us keep the public show free for everyone while you continue to get bonus content in the very personal Patreon member feed that you get access to, which includes jibber jabber up front, questions with our guests at the end, stuff that the public feed does not have. And it helps us, of course, keep investing in our community and offering fun extras. We count on it to keep the servers hot. Visit patreon.com/the ADHD podcast to learn more. And, speaking of things that you'd like to take control of, our book, Unapologetically ADHD, is finally, I don't know if it's a finally, I think right on time, is coming out in paperback on October the 28th.
It's not apologizing for it.
No, we're not apologizing for anything. No, it arrives, top hat and tails, right on time. You can pre-order it right now where you get your books and get the new edition right on release day. So if you've been holding off on the hardback, no judgment there either. But now we have the full set. We have the paperback coming October. We've got the audiobook. We've got the hardback. We have not done a live reenactment of the book or like a diorama. Those probably are going to have to wait on those. But we definitely have all the key formats. So
you mean it's not coming out in a movie anytime soon?
Yeah, we're going to do a movie. We're going to do a movie. Anyhow.
I wonder who would play you and who would play me. We'll have to think about that.
Brad Pitt and Reese Witherspoon.
Oh, nice.
Nailing it. Just crushing it. Yep. Finally, connect with us on Take Control.
You kind of look like a Ben Affleck to me. Sorry. you kind of look like a Ben Affleck. I could see him doing that with you.
This may be the most ADHD intro you've ever allowed me to do.
I know. Sorry. All right. Back on track.
Finally, please connect with us at TakeControlADHD.com for episodes and our mailing list. Jump into the ADHD Discord community at TakeControlADHD.com/Discord and find us on the socials at TakeControlADHD. Picture this. You're scrolling through TikTok at 2 a.m. You're watching someone explain how losing their keys is actually a profound neurological condition, and you think, wait, that's me. Could I have ADHD? I didn't even know when I wrote that it rhymes, but I'm very proud. Meanwhile, across town, a family doctor is prescribing Adderall after a 15-minute chat, while in another office, a woman who's struggled for decades is being told her symptoms are just anxiety again. Welcome to the contradictory world of adult ADHD diagnosis in 2025, where we're simultaneously overdiagnosing and underdiagnosing at the same time. Today, we are joined by Dr. Amie DeHarpporte, a licensed psychologist who specializes in ADHD assessment, basically a detective for brains. What makes her fascinating is that she spent over a decade as a high school teacher teaching before becoming a psychologist. So she's seen ADHD from both sides of the classroom door. She's here to help us talk about the ins and outs of assessment and diagnosis and testing and all that great stuff as an adult. Dr. DeHarpporte, welcome to the ADHD podcast.
Thank you very much. Glad to be here.
I apologize for all that fiddle faddle up front. That was just too much. It was too much.
Oh, good. I'm intrigued by the question of who would play you, Pete.
Right?
Do you have an opinion just right off the dome?
No, I'm just gonna take a pass on that one.
So Ryan Reynolds, you say. Excellent.
Ben
I'll take
Affleck
that.
isn't good enough for you. Anything I say
May not be good.
Yeah. No.
He
Ryan
wants
Reynolds
Brad
is fine.
Pitt.
It was Brad Pitt. Now it's Ryan Reynolds. I've already changed my mind. Okay. Here we go. What is going on with the diagnosis space in ADHD, and particularly for our prospective adults?
Well, I think you named it really well, that there are tensions. I think there are dilemmas for the psychologist where we don't want to overdiagnose, but we don't want to underdiagnose. And there are groups of people, there are individual stories of people who have struggled for a long time and who have life has been harder than it needs to be, and it has not been recognized. And they've banged their head against the wall for a long time saying, what's wrong with me? Why is this not being recognized? And then at the same time, there are challenges in being accurate with diagnosis when we are faced with a lot of people seeing traits that all humans have and recognizing themselves in them and assuming that it's ADHD, when in fact what they're behaviorally demonstrating isn't necessarily outside of what would be kind of part of the normal distribution of human traits. So the question is, where do you draw the line? How do you draw the line? How do you do that when you have incomplete information, and when you're trying to separate out what a person's individual experience is versus how that compares to what would be diagnostic?
That's fascinating. You just said something that I find potentially triggering. What is the impact of social media on shrinking? I say shrinking sort of presumptively the general sort of common knowledge of what is the normal distribution of human traits.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
I mean, it's a good question. There are emerging research coming out about social media and TikTok in particular. I'm not up on the specifics of it, but I will say that there's been a lot of informal talk among psychologists of kind of folks coming in with assumptions and sometimes a lot of surety about this is the diagnosis that I qualify for, and telling kind of reasons why. And sometimes those reasons can be traced to really inaccurate assumptions. So I'll give you an example of one. I had a client come in and say, I cricket my feet, so I must be on the spectrum. And apparently she had seen a TikTok video where someone an autistic person was describing their experience, and they were talking about rubbing their feet together in bed at night before they fell asleep. And they labeled that as an autistic trait. And so the client said to me, that's me. And that was kind of part of what really inspired her to seek out diagnosis. And it was kind of hard for me to say, but I said, I just need to let you know that that's not actually in the official symptom list of autism spectrum disorder. And so there's some inaccurate information out there about what a diagnosis really entails, what the criteria are. And it can be painful, I think, for people who feel like their individual experience is being recognized in a wider community. And yet when they go to get the quote unquote official, something that makes them feel like they're actually legitimate, they're being gatekept. And so it's hard as a psychologist to be the one to say no when someone doesn't meet up with the full criteria, because our job is to not kind of just put the rubber stamp on people's perceptions or assumptions coming in. That's why we have an assessment process. That's why we go through all this testing. That's why sometimes we take a full day doing all this, because a lot of things can sound like one thing on the surface, but actually have another cause. Just because someone's coughing doesn't mean it's necessarily COVID. It could be bronchitis. It could be pneumonia. It could be something caught in your throat. There are a lot of symptoms that look very similar on the surface, but have different causation underneath. And that's the psychologist's job, is to sort that out. And that can sometimes be a really complex process.
Oh, I can imagine, because there's so many overlap of characteristics and symptoms of things that I can see where you have a tough job for sure. When Pete said, I don't know if you called her a private eye or an investigator, but I can see that fitting very well.
For example, anxiety and ADHD do have a lot of overlap. If you just look at the symptom criteria, some of the symptom criteria of having your mind racing and rumination, of irritability, of restlessness, difficulty with sleep. Well, those all sound really familiar to folks with ADHD, right? Those are literally in the symptom criteria list for anxiety. So there's a lot of overlap in symptoms. And the question is, what's the cause? Like, what's the wellspring underneath the kind of, the surface? Well, we don't always know that right away.
One of the things that we've long sort of hung our hats on for this show, if you look at the show's sort of ideology, it's that, we're talking to adults with ADHD, to college students with ADHD, and we're talking about the tools and strategies that can help you wrangle your ADHD, whether or not you have a diagnosis. Because you know what? Like, sometimes all of those sort of commonalities that you experience, like cricketing your legs, just for one example, if you feel like you have a bucket of these experiences and the tools and strategies help you, why not use them? Go ahead, right? That's fine. You cannot have ADHD, and a lot of the things we talk about on this show are bangers for just life hacks, right? They're things that will help you live your life.
I love that. I completely agree. And I would say I do a lot of recommendation, even for folks who, sometimes it's the diagnosis that is given is not necessarily an ADHD clinical diagnosis, but it is subclinical symptoms of ADHD. Like, yes, there's a reason why you came in. Yes, you are experiencing it. Yes, this is real. Absolutely. And you don't necessarily reach the threshold of symptom criteria that would be needed for an official diagnosis, but you are definitely struggling with this constellation of things. And all of the strategies that work for someone with ADHD are going to work for you. So look into them and use them. You don't have to meet some official criteria list for this to be useful for you.
Well, that gets to one of the things that I want you to help us do today, which is, because we talk to people all the time about, should I get a diagnosis? What is the importance of getting a diagnosis? And what goes into a diagnosis? Like, if I want to be official, whatever that means, what does it take, right? I don't understand who I have to talk to, what they're going to ask me to do. And I was hoping that you could just document for us podcastually, what does it look like if I have a sense that I may have these traits, to make it official? What does a testing day look like?
Well, it kind of depends on who you go to. So there are a lot of different people who can diagnose ADHD, and there's some misassumptions in this in people assuming that they do need to go get what they will sometimes call neuropsych testing, which is actually a misnomer, because neuropsychologists have specific training in psychology that make them experts in things like, organic brain disorders like Alzheimer's or epilepsy. You don't actually have to have a neuropsychologist diagnose ADHD. So within the realm of psychology, any psychologist can do it, but also so can a master's level clinician. So in my state, at least in many states, a psychologist is a doctoral level clinician, someone who has their PhD or their PsyD. But master's level clinicians can also diagnose ADHD with a diagnostic assessment, it's called. It's usually the first time you meet them. They ask you, so what brings you in? And you have a conversation. That can be enough to put a diagnosis down on the chart. ADHD is no different than anxiety or depression or any other mental health disorder that any mental health clinician can diagnose. You can also go to a doctor, a physician, and like you said, often that's a very brief conversation. And I've talked to a lot of folks who will get started on medication after one brief conversation. Is that an official diagnosis? Yeah, it's if we think about a diagnosis and what it is, it's actually coding that allows insurance to reimburse for the time spent with the professional. So if a doctor is coding that session, they're going to, and they're prescribing medication, they're going to code it under ADHD. So they've given a diagnosis. Now that's a different level of thoroughness, and a 1 hour diagnostic assessment with a therapist is a different level of thoroughness than going in for a psychological assessment with a psychologist who's going to spend half a day or a whole day doing a whole battery of testing. Now, the question is that necessary? And I think actually a lot of folks in the field were talking about, are we over testing? Is that really necessary to do that much testing to come up with the diagnosis when there are other ways of doing it that are a lot more efficient and not as expensive? And maybe it's self-serving of psychologists to be jumping through all these hoops when a lot of the tools we have, honestly, are kind of flawed. And, I think we can talk more about that. But this certainty that we have after half a day of testing is not necessarily that much greater in order to justify the time and expense as it would be going to a therapist or talking to the therapist you've been seeing for anxiety or whatever other struggles you've had, and they know you well, and that maybe they say, hey, some of these things you're saying, they sound kind of like ADHD.
I have
Let's
a
go ahead and
question.
make it official. Mhm.
I have a question, because what is the difference? Like, I know you were talking about who can diagnose, but I'm curious, like, if I go to a therapist, a talk therapist, and that person says, oh, it kind of sounds a little bit like you have ADHD, can that person make that diagnosis? A therapist?
Yes, they can. Yes.
Okay.
It's no different than anxiety or depression or anything else. Often what they will do is they will refer out for testing. And part of the reason for that is because the onus is a little higher with ADHD because one of the favored treatments for ADHD is medication.
Right.
And
And
so
they can't do the medication.
they do the medication. But a lot of them, I think, want to ensure that if someone is getting medication, that there's been a thorough diagnostic process that happens, because there are side effects of medication, and there can be costs associated with that in terms of, if someone has anxiety, putting their central nervous system on a stimulant can actually make things worse. So, and there's, obviously potential for abuse. So there's, I think, some wanting to be reassured that their instinct is accurate. They'll refer someone out for more thorough testing, especially if the presentation is maybe a little bit more complicated with comorbidities or things like that. But they could actually diagnose someone. The tricky thing is that one of the reasons, and I know we're talking about adult diagnosis, but for children, at least, in order to get accommodations in schools, sometimes it depends on the state, but in many states, they're only professionals that hold certain degrees are allowed to make diagnoses that qualify to open the door for an IEP. So, for example, a psychologist diagnosis of ADHD is required in order to start the IEP process, or not to start the IEP process, but to qualify under other health impairment. Um, or a medical doctor. So that's why sometimes we'll get someone who has been diagnosed with a therapist be referred to us to sort of make official that diagnosis that then can be shared with the school for accommodation reasons.
That was one of the things that I found so interesting. I mean, we're talking about these short conversations that can, or an hour conversation with your therapist that can end in a diagnosis, when the battery of testing that we had to undergo for our kids was extraordinary. It took days. It took people, it took all of the collateral information gathering from others, from peers, from parents, from teachers. It took, the standardized testing and rating scales to align to, DSM criteria. Like it was a significant thing. And I'll never forget the therapist that was performing the testing came out of the room in 15 minutes. And I said, "So what do you think?" He said, "Oh, no, definitely. We know exactly what this is. We don't, as if to imply, we don't need to go on. We're doing it pro forma. We just have to check a lot of boxes." I don't hear a lot of adults going through that same sort of rigor, and I'm guessing it's because there are fewer barriers. There's no, you can't get accommodations unless once you're out of school. I don't hear people saying that at work. You have to have a 10-hour diagnostic evaluation. Any letter from your therapist is going to do, kind of a thing.
Right. I think it's the process is not codified in the same way for adults as it is for, under special education law for children. And so
Right.
there isn't kind of the same hoops to jump through. And you're right that there are a lot of data gathering and performance testing, and a lot of times it involves IQ testing, memory testing, computerized test of attention, executive function testing. There are a whole lot of things that we do. And I know I just said earlier, I'm not sure that is justified in terms of time and expense compared to, in obvious cases, what a therapist could pick up on in an hour. A well-trained therapist would be able to make that judgment and like, oh yeah, obviously, that's not a question. I think where testing is really useful is in cases where it's more complicated, where I think about arrows kind of pointing in different directions. And every piece of data that I get in an evaluation, whether it's from a rating scale from a teacher, or a self-report from the structured interview with the person themselves, or a rating scale from a spouse, or a test of attention, it's all in each one of those I think of as an arrow pointing in one direction or another. Sometimes the arrows all point in the same direction, and then it's really obvious. Sometimes they don't. Sometimes they point in different directions. Sometimes they point toward anxiety. Sometimes they point toward sleep. Sometimes they point toward history of a head injury. Sometimes they point toward depression. And sometimes they point at multiple things simultaneously. And so then what you need is someone to really, like you said, be a detective, put their detective hat on and slow the process down, take the time to gather the timeline of events. Because if we think about ADHD as a neurodevelopmental disorder that shows signs before age 12, there should be symptoms across the life course. And so if someone comes in as an adult and says, "Oh, I've really been struggling with deadlines at work," and this is the first time that's happening to them, and it's corresponding with the divorce, right? That maybe is a different story than someone who has struggled throughout their life but has never been picked up on, and they had poor grades, but it was attributed to low motivation or to, maybe they just weren't cut out for school. But, they always thought maybe something was going on, and then they come in, and it's because something's happened, maybe demands have increased in their life, and now they're motivated to come in. I just had an adult that I diagnosed recently where she sort of had this history of job hopping. She had this history of, I think, went to 3 different colleges. She had been, in school told she was really smart, but she, just wasn't motivated enough. And she finally got to a point in her adult life where she was kind of tired of feeling stupid or inadequate and wanted to know. And I kind of said to her a little bit what you said, Pete, of like, because on the phone, I talk to people on the phone before they come in for testing. And because we don't take insurance, this is a pretty significant out-of-pocket outlay. So I do a lot of actually counseling people against getting testing, which is a terrible business model. But what I'll say is like, read the books on ADHD, listen to the podcasts, those tools that work for people, they can work for you. You don't necessarily need to come in, and do this half day of testing if you've have all these things going on in your life. Act as if, and you can get to the same point whether or not you have this official stamp or not, because it's not going to get you accommodations like it would, in school. And she said, no, I just want to know. And she said, I've had therapists who have told me over the years, like, oh, maybe it's ADHD, but they don't really know. And it's not really, they haven't really looked into it. And it seems like they're just kind of guessing. And I want to go to someone who really is an expert in this. Can you help me out? And so we sat down, we put together her whole chronology of life and what was happening at different times and when the symptoms were there, and were the symptoms there prior to when she was having these other things going on in her life, prior to when she started using cannabis. Was she struggling, or did it only come with the, I mean, because
Okay.
right?
Is that a red flag? I don't know.
Well, maybe, but also we
Maybe.
know that people with ADHD have a higher rate of substance use.
Yeah, that's what I mean, right?
Yeah. Well, right.
Yeah.
The red flag in that way. Right.
Right.
So chicken and egg, right?
Yeah.
So it could be that, because also the long-term effects of cannabis use can mimic a lot of ADHD symptoms. So it could be an after effect, but it could also be a reason why she's self-medicating. So we kind of sat down and looked at all of it, and it became clear through looking at the chronology that no, these symptoms were there from the time that she was a young kid. And I talked to her mom, and her mom told me all the stories that teachers would tell about her. And I was like, oh, this is someone who is just overlooked for years. And that was very validating to her. I will say, like, she got a little teary when I talked to her in the feedback session. She said, oh, this makes so much sense.
It sounds like that's what she needed, was the validation, right? Because as humans, we want to be seen, we want to be heard, and we want to be taken seriously. And I think that sometimes doctors have a way of being in such a rush that they don't take your concerns, very seriously. And it's interesting because I had a doctor's appointment recently, and I was so impressed with what she said, because I was telling her this issue I was having, this pain in my leg, and we were kind of talking about different things that it might be. And she goes, I don't want to discount this. And I want, I'm not discounting this. So let's just, wait and see what happens. And then if it's still going on, I want you to contact me, da, da, da. And I really appreciated her saying, I'm not discounting you.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's something about that,
So you didn't even know you needed to hear it until she said it.
Right.
Yeah.
And then it made me realize, like, oh, right. I just want her to take this seriously, because I'm worried with my own anxiety that I have a blood clot and I'm going to die.
Right.
Right.
And one of the
Like,
things
that's what I'm thinking. Yeah.
One of the things I do, I feel like, is my job is to tell someone's story. So I write all this out. If you've ever gone through a psychological evaluation for ADHD, if you're going to someone who is thorough and really takes their time and is interested in, I mean, the question for me when someone comes in is not ADHD or not. The question is, what is going on here? Tell me about your experience and help me understand what it's like to be you. And there are going to be things that are hard for you, and there are going to be things that are, amazing strengths. But there's a reason why you're coming in. Let's understand it. And let's put it all together in a story that helps you understand it. So ideally, when I do my feedback sessions, which are 2 hours long after all of this process of gathering all this information, there should be no surprises. Everything I say to the person, they should nod along. I know I'm on track because they're like, yes, exactly. That's right. And of course, it's nothing new, right? It's everything that they've told me, or people that they care about or who care about them have told me about them, or things I've observed about them. But my role is to put it together in a way that makes it make sense together, so that they can make sense of their own experience. Like, oh, you mean that experience with, you know, the boyfriend, that experience with the job, that experience with the parenting, like that's all part of the same thing. Oh, that makes sense. I feel heard. I feel seen. Yes. So it's their own experience. I think about there's a New Yorker cartoon of someone in a therapist's office, and the thought bubble above their head was this kind of tangle of yarn. And then the therapist's speech bubble is a yarn in a ball, like a nicely wound ball, and the person's smiling. It's like, okay, I'm going to take this big tangle, I'm just going to organize it for you and give it right back to you in a way that hopefully is empowering and that helps you make sense and move forward.
What I'm hearing so much is that you may not need, subjectively, you may not need a diagnosis. You may know in your heart of hearts exactly how you live in the world. What you're paying for with this admittedly expensive process of getting a thorough test is you're paying for patience. You're paying to take the time to do the whole job, and you're paying to be heard at a level of thoroughness that you don't get just about anywhere else.
Mm-hmm.
You're paying to do it all at once.
I think that's true. And I would say additionally, you're paying for objectivity. So one thing that's, yes, therapists can make the diagnosis, but it can be fraught a little bit if you've been seeing a therapist for a long time, or, so a testing psychologist is someone who, you don't go to therapy with them afterwards, probably. They kind of fly in, fly out. And so they can sort of put together the whole process and then give you the kind of honest assessment without fearing what the repercussions will be for the relationship, because they are going to tell you the truth. And I think that also involves looking at other things that might be going on. So when we're talking about adults, especially, adults have a long time to accumulate a lot of experiences and a lot of things that can go on in their lives that can lead to symptoms in various realms. So again, when we're talking about like the cough of COVID versus bronchitis, is that ADHD, or could there be anxiety going on? Could there be depression going on? How about after effects of a concussion, or sleep issues? Chronic sleep is a huge issue.
And autoimmune diseases too.
Yes, absolutely.
My husband has MS, and my daughter has an autoimmune disease that we're still trying to figure out what it is. But like a lot of the ADHD symptoms come from that too, right? Like,
yep.
Yeah.
Thyroid is another one. I'm not a doctor, so I try to stay in my lane. I'm not going to go down the road of medical diagnosis, but what I can do is I can refer people to, could this issue you have with, listening to directions and not being able to, discern what people are saying to you in a crowded room, could that be auditory processing disorder? Well, I'm not going to diagnose that, but I'm going to send someone to an audiologist, because I can tell you it's not ADHD. And if it's not, I can still say you have this pattern of strengths and challenges, and the challenges are real. Even if you're not getting the diagnosis of ADHD, people come to us for a reason. They're struggling in their lives. It's not just for funsies, right? And so my job is to, even if I'm not giving an ADHD diagnosis, to say, yes, this is real, and there are people who can help you.
The fascinating thing for me in all of this is my assumption would have been that the complexities of some cases, the complexities of the cases where folks are not just ADHD, right? You're talking about those arrows pointing in different directions. Teasing out the complexity there would come with a longer term relationship with your regular therapist. But what I'm hearing is through this sort of critical evaluation process, you can tease out what is depression, anxiety disorders, what is trauma-based, experiences, what is learning disorders and sleep disorders and substance use disorders. Like, you can tease all of those things out as a part of this overall diagnostic experience.
Sometimes.
Yeah, and to what level of confidence,
Right.
I guess.
Yes,
Yeah.
I think that's a great question. I think the longer I have been in this field, the more humble I am. And the more I talk with people about holding it lightly. I kind of use this metaphor of like, just hold it lightly. Because whether it's a diagnosis or a non-diagnosis or a pointing in another direction, there's still information that's going to be gathered over time. And we know that people, ADHD, the course of ADHD fluctuates. Like the update to the huge MTA study, the multimodal study of ADHD, longitudinal study, actually found that in 64% of people, their symptoms waxed and waned over the life course, which is kind of a big deal because we've thought traditionally of ADHD as sort of this neurodevelopmental diagnosis that is static over the course of the life cycle. And that's not necessarily true. And environmental factors play a huge part, and stressors and all sorts of different and interestingly, in between individual comparisons, they found that individuals who have more stressors, greater demands on them, actually end up showing greater resolution of ADHD symptoms than individuals who don't.
It doesn't surprise me.
Whoa.
It's counterintuitive. So this is counterintuitive. So in between individual comparisons, people who have more stressors, they show fewer ADHD symptoms in adulthood. Probably because they've had to develop coping mechanisms.
Exactly. Right? And they're under that pressure and adrenaline that is forcing them to get things done, right? Like they have that external factor that is pushing them, the urgency. Yeah, right. That's why, if you look at first responders and, how many of those people have ADHD, I bet it's a pretty high percentage.
And if you think about kind of ADHD also in the sort of neurodiversity lens of the mismatch between the person and the environment, it may be that people with ADHD need high demand, high novelty,
yes.
high
Right.
stimulation
jobs,
right? So, but then if you look, here's the other counterintuitive piece. If you look at within person comparisons, so like a person compared to themselves over the life cycle, greater stressors lead to more ADHD symptoms. Right? Which also makes sense in the sense that at times of stress, when we're flooded and overwhelmed, we can really struggle more than when we can just take a break and gather ourselves, right? So there's some interesting conflicting and yet to be determined non-conclusive information of what we're learning about people with ADHD in these long-term studies. But one of them is that it's not stable and it doesn't always look the same at every single point in time. And so that leads to some humility for me in terms of what I see walking into my office at any point in time. I do my very best, and I do have the luxury of time because I work in private practice. And I think just as a person, I'm really curious and I seek to understand, and I'm really trying to show up for this person to help them make sense of what they're going through. And I have imperfect tools that have a lot of flaws, and there's no such thing as an ADHD test. We have no single instrument that is predictive of ADHD, and anyone who thinks that you can take a computerized test of attention or an IQ test or anything else and have it say thumbs up or thumbs down to ADHD is vastly overestimating what's going on behind the curtain. It's really much more of an art than a science. I hope that I'm bringing some value to the table, and that, my clients tell me that. They thank me and they say, oh, this makes so much sense to me. But I also tell them in a lot of cases, like, this is where you're at today. This is a snapshot of you in time, understanding you in light of your history, but your future has yet to be written. And we'll see what happens from here.
You said that, the testing might be a little bit extreme for, are we doing a real service with the thoroughness of the diagnostic experience? What would you like to see if you could, wave your magic wand and just change the diagnosis experience for folks? What do you feel like, so you just said it's more of an art than a science. How would you craft the perfect diagnostic experience for someone?
I do think that thoroughness is a benefit. I think when we're talking about briefer testing processes, it's usually because of the pressures of insurance and affordability and accessibility. And so within our field, we're talking about, can we take these pieces out? It's in service of expediency and of access. And access is important. I mean, I think there's a real ethical issue when insurance only reimburses, a limited number of units for testing of ADHD. And so the folks who take insurance are trying to cram all that testing into a very short time, and they end up kind of just churning it out and not able to really take the time to give people a thorough experience. So I do think that the move toward trying briefer evaluations is in service of that, which I don't think is a great thing. So I do think a really accurate and thorough ADHD evaluation experience should involve IQ or cognitive testing. It should involve memory testing. It should involve executive functioning testing. It should include a computerized test of attention, even though those are flawed, but they have some what we call incremental validity, which means that they add on something. They're not enough on its own to stand alone, but as one more layer, they can be helpful. Should include self-report and a really thorough diagnostic interview with the individual. So when I do intake interviews, I do at least an hour and a half. I actually block 2 hours out on my calendar because it often goes to that, because I really want to understand the experience of someone walking in my office, especially again in light of their timeline, and gathering collateral information. So from a spouse or a roommate, or a colleague or a best friend, because one thing we've found is with externalizing disorders like ADHD, people aren't always the best judge of their behavior in comparison to others, right? Internalizing disorders like anxiety and depression, the person experiencing only knows what's going on within themselves the best. But in externalizing disorders that show up behaviorally, the people around them are actually in some ways better at saying, yeah, the amount you lose your keys, that is outside of what is normal. Like, yeah, right. People lose their keys, but when you are running around like a chicken with your head cut off constantly, when you every day are having trouble meeting this deadline at work, like that's out of the range of what's typical. So gathering information from people around the individual, and especially people who knew them when. So this is tricky sometimes for adults because they don't always have great relationships with parents, or sometimes parents have passed away, or there's trauma there, things like that. But if we really want to establish that this is ADHD, one thing we know about ADHD is its presence of symptoms before the age of 12. And so we want to look at, again, adults have had a lot of things happen to them and a lot of things going on. Maybe they experienced a major depressive episode and have ongoing persistent depression in adulthood, and they have symptoms in adulthood. How can we distinguish between those two things? Well, one thing we can do is we can look back before your first depressive episode hit. What was going on? Were you having trouble with organization? Were you having trouble with, et cetera, et cetera? Then we can get some comparison points. And so early information is really helpful. I will often talk to people about transcripts, grades, teacher comments, things like that from elementary school. I would love to have
even
that.
For adults.
Yeah. Especially for adults.
Yeah.
Because
you're looking for that pattern.
Right. We're looking for the pattern. And one thing we know about people generally is people generally are not great reporters. They're not great reporters currently. They're also not great reporters of the past. Right. Our recollection of the past is made in the present. It's colored by who we are today. It's not a snapshot. It's not a one-to-one correlation.
Well, especially with someone with ADHD, right? Like when you think about what executive functions, are requiring you to look in the past, like it is going to be skewed. And something that I know from working with so many ADHDers is they're incredibly hard on themselves.
Yep. So, I was just going to say that. So actually people who qualify for diagnosis of ADHD actually tend to underreport their symptoms.
Yeah.
There is a concern about overreporting of symptoms. Some people who don't qualify for a diagnosis will overreport, and they'll say, "Oh, I've kids not uncommonly when I diagnose like college students who will say like, oh, I'm really, really struggling. I'm doing terribly in my classes. And you request their transcript and it's all A's. And so, yes, they're struggling for them, but compared to others, it's not pathological. It's not out of the range of what's neurotypical. But people with ADHD tend to underreport symptoms. And so you'll ask them, so how did school go for you when you were now? Oh, it was fine. It was good. But then you look at the transcript and there are all these I can't pay attention in class, struggles with deadlines, all these things. But for them, that was just normal. That was just life, right? They didn't know that there was a different way to do it. Yeah. They just thought that school is terrible for everyone. They didn't know that they were struggling in a system that was not built for them.
I would love to hear, let's just say you and I have been working together and you've done my assessment. What is your general advice for new adult diagnoses? What do you tell me as I walk out of your office?
I think it really depends on what the constellation of strengths and challenges are that we found during your evaluation, and especially about what your self-narrative is. Everyone comes in with a story of who they are. And, for some people, they're really hard on themselves. And if they're coming in feeling like they're stupid, feeling like they're not good enough, feeling like everyone else can do it and they can't, well, then that's what I'm going to focus on. And okay, what this diagnosis means is a reprieve for you from that narrative. And now the future looks like recognizing your strengths and recognizing that the story you've been telling all this time was you being hard on yourself for something that was beyond your control, and also not recognizing the strengths and the amazing parts of you that is the flip side of that coin. And you just take that for granted, and you're looking all the time at the ways that you don't measure up, and you don't even recognize these amazing things that you have going for you that you just assume is like, oh, well, anyone can do that. No, anyone can't. That's actually pretty remarkable. So, that might be one focus. For someone else, it might be something completely different. So again, for me, it's not about diagnosis, yes or no, just knowing like, okay, this is someone newly diagnosed with ADHD. What does this mean for them? I couldn't tell you. What I would need to know is what is everything that's gone on that's happened to bring them into my office, and helping make sense of that for them. What does that mean for them going forward?
Well, in any case, you unlock a dictionary of new language and new ways to think about yourself and how you relate to the world. And that is a massive gift of the process.
Well, one thing I say, look at the resources out there. Look at the podcast, look at the books, look at, Chad, look at, there's so many resources, and it's almost like permission, I can take it, that applies to me. Mm-hmm. That could make sense for me. Yep. It absolutely. So, I sometimes feel like I'm kind of like Dorothy, like click your heels.
Mm-hmm.
You've had the power all along. But sometimes people feel like they need that permission to say, like, yes, this is you, and yes, you can take advantage of these resources.
It's beautiful, Amie.
Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you for doing this with us. I sure appreciate your wisdom.
Absolutely, it was a joy. Thanks for talking. For both of you.
Where would you send people to learn more about the work that you do?
Well, I am a testing psychologist in Eden Prairie, Minnesota. My practice is called Portage Psychology, and we are at portagepsych.com. So anyone who's interested in seeking out testing with me is certainly welcome to go to our website. We have a contact us form.
And do they have to be in Minnesota, or can they be? They do. Okay.
So I was going to say, it's going to be a very narrow segment of your audience.
But, I will say, just visiting the website will help you see the patterns of things you should be looking for a testing clinician in your area. Yeah, so if you want a template, there's a lot of great information there.
Yep. I will say that there's a lot of variation in kind of the approaches that clinicians take, and we do try to fall on the more kind of thorough and humanistic side of things, I would say. So if you're interested in looking at what that looks like, you can go to the website.
Perfect. Well,
thank you both very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Amie, and thank you, everybody, for downloading and listening to this show. We appreciate your time and your attention. Don't forget, if you have something to contribute to the conversation, we're heading over to the Show Talk channel in the Discord server. You can join us right there by becoming a supporting member at the deluxe level or better, patreon.com/the ADHD podcast. On behalf of Nikki Kinzer and Amie DeHarpporte, I'm Pete Wright. We'll see you right back here next week on Taking Control, the ADHD podcast.